Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Olaf Schlieper, Innovation Manager from the German National Tourist Board. And we are very proud to be the sponsor of this event because it is so important, and the German travel trade is very much aware of the need of development of services, products, tourism products for people with accessibility needs. And if you want to know more about what we are doing in this case, please feel free to welcome to visit me on session 14 tomorrow morning. Don't miss to have a look on the USB cards. You have them in your bag with a lot of information and even for films about offers for people with disabilities in Germany. So now it's my pleasure to welcome Markus Weisen. He is internationally respected for 25 years now of commitment to the cultural rights of people with disabilities. And as a consultant, his clients include the Louvre Museum in Paris, the English Heritage, Cultural Heritage Norway, and the European Blind Union. He is expert for the European Center for Cultural Accessibility in Paris, the École de Design in Nantes, Atlantique, and Urbexess. Markus was director, Magistrate for Accessible Digital Culture, Health and Disability Advisor for the Museums, Libraries, and Archives Council in England, and Arts Officer for the Royal National Institute of Blind People, where he led, for example, the European Cities Within Reach project. And he was founder and member of ICREA, the European Committee for the Creativity by and with Disabled Persons. So now give a warm applause to Markus, and the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Herr Schlieper, für diese schöne Einführung. Thank you for this nice introduction. Bonjour tout le monde, c'est un grand plaisir de me trouver auprès de collègues québécois. Good morning everyone, nice to see some familiar faces here. Perhaps nicer even to see many new faces and to be embarked on a common journey towards shared goals. We will be looking today at cultural accessibility, and I'd like to congratulate warmly the organizers of this conference, because it is truly a very vital part of tourism. The European Commission estimates that 40% of the total tourism spend goes towards cultural tourism. And so we have an opportunity here of looking more closely at joining up the dots in this indeed disjointed scene that should get us towards a seamless travel and tourism experience. Now let me check if I manage this. I'm very bad at technology, I'll tell you. Here we go. So, a quick plan. A few words about transformative experiences in accessible tourism from my working life. Then a look at the real big gap between the wonderful policies we have and the stark reality on the ground. A few examples looking at how engagement with accessible culture for disabled people actually makes everyone win. And then looking at a couple of recommendations. You know, on all the number plates of Québécois cars, you see a lovely sentence, je me souviens, I remember. So I shall also remember some of my past and some errors of my past. And I hope I will be able at the end of it to say, like Edith Piaf, non, je ne regrette rien. No, I don't regret, I have no regrets. So, transformative experiences. In 1985, Sylvie, a blind friend of mine from Geneva, came to visit me at Oxford, where I taught some French. Over the period of a week, we looked at the acoustics of cloisters, fondled sculptures in religious institutions like college chapels, ate at College Hall, went to the botanic gardens and explored the temperatures and textures of green houses and the different moistures, and did all sorts of things that at the end of 1 week undressed me in my ignorance. I had always thought beauty is visual, and Sylvie inadvertently showed me, no, it's about something that is being inoculated and lived by the whole body, by internal sensations and all sorts of sensory perceptions. So what I do during that project, it led me to create a project of multisensory tourism for visually impaired people that quickly became one of blind people, partially sighted people and sighted people. Over 1 week, we gave about 30 optional programs to a total of 30 participants, half of whom had a sight impairment. Going to places like I mentioned to you earlier, museums, college chapels, cloisters, botanic gardens, nature reserves. And I wanted to show you what I learned from this experience. One was really the beauty of sharing, which is that we all got good at handling things, even sighted people. We got good at hugging each other, but we also got good at learning from each other. And I really fundamentally believe that many of the sighted participants, and certainly myself included, learned a lot and had their perceptions of environment and heritage as it is modified by this wonderful interaction. I also inadvertently, without having ever followed a management course, went onto the path of user involvement and spoke with about 30 blind and partially sighted people before doing this pilot holiday. And that was a great learning experience. We spent a minute without speaking, 20 of us, under a tree which Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, loved, which leads me to think that there was something in an atmosphere here that, irrespective of our ability or disability, we could all share. Here's something wonderful that is little exploited as a ground for sharing in the heritage industry, if you want. But more importantly for today, I organized a group holiday, very energy intensive, and of course it did not lead to any sustainable infrastructure for visitors with a disability to experience when they want it on location. Should I regret it? Dois-je regretter? This project also led to European cities within reach, where with international partners and working for the Royal National Institute of Blind People, we created in the early 90s a city cultural guide for Venice, Turin, Paris and London, and sold over 1,500 copies in accessible media, which was a lot for that time. But when we look at the lessons learned, I and some of my colleagues shared extraordinary enthusiasm of youth. We also made some amazing blunders. We were not tourism professionals. Our outputs had no inbuilt sustainability because my organization, London Tourist Board, the national museums with whom we worked, had never thought that we could actually implant this in a sustainable way and let it grow. So the project died out, like so many of the experiences some of us have done. I would love our conference to turn into a reflective conference indeed, as Scott said, where we also look at our failures, our difficulties we have, and also the experiences we have learned and how we begin to reflect on shaping the future. So one of the nice things actually of the project was that in the city tourist guides about, for example, museums, there was a brief description of accessible museum pieces for blind visitors. For example, 6 life-size Roman sculptures and a vintage Morris Minor car, or whatever you want. Our group believed that it was a fundamental necessity to allow blind and partially sighted people to make their own holiday choices and decisions. And yet I have not seen in the past 20 years any other accessible tourist guide take this on. I don't take any pride in our group having come up with that. I simply want to say that you yourselves will probably have had some wonderful experiences and thoughts that have not been filtered and funneled into the development of a standard, and perhaps this conference is beginning to give us the opportunities to do so. One of my learning experiences was that around that time in Newcastle, a group of disability arts activists published an access to art galleries guide, and they always indicated the distance to the nearest means of transport, because, again, it allows independent choice-making, personalization, decision-making. Yet, apart from the website of the Tate Modern and a couple of others out of hundreds I have looked at, no accessible tourism guide mentions distances. Why don't we learn, or why are we so slow in learning? So again, I hope that today and tomorrow, with all your experiences, we can actually revisit the mix of what could be a future standard. Let's quickly look at what our wonderful international policies say to cultural accessibilities. You all know the UN Convention, maybe less so that Article 30 talks about the right of equal access to culture. I quickly ask you a rhetorical question. Is equal access to the fabulous cultural riches of the world ever going to be practically possible? I give you a very quick answer. We could engage for a day with this. No. If you wanted to audio describe all the objects that are at the Museum of Fine Arts in this city and provide sign language in langue des signes québécoise and in ASL, well, you would actually blow the entire learning, education, communication budgets, and perhaps the museum would have to close. Nor is it necessarily a great thing. We want to have a concept by which we look at the cultural significance of a work of art, of a museum, of a heritage place, of a theatre, of a cinema, of a street festival, and then see how can we make the best of it accessible, how can we offer a quality experience that might be a more strategic use of our funding. And behold, we have a wonderful policy here from no less than the Council of Europe that actually helps us put this utopian aspiration into practice. Plan now for the long term. And I quote it for you. It's a mysterious recommendation called R92.6. Nobody knows about in Europe, frankly. But it says government institutions, leisure and cultural organizations should develop comprehensive plans and policies to bring significant and lasting improvements for all people with disabilities. That is quite wonderful. When I look at all destinations, be they called accessible or not, whether they have done significant improvements, I may not be able to open my hand and say there is one that has done those significant improvements if I use the idea of sharing the best of the significance of the cultural life and heritage as a criterion for significant improvements. It's not good enough if in any city you have a museum with, say, 5 or 6 objects of third-rate quality that a blind person can touch, or 2 or 3 objects that bear no relationship to the structure, the coherence, and the significance and the wealth of the cultural collection to deaf people by providing, for example, sign language. We need really to raise the stakes and step up our standing about how we share culture. And policies do not create culture, they are there to serve culture. So I wanted to quote you what culture might be about. It is something quite a bit deeper that reaches us in the greatest depths of our existence. And to illustrate that, I chose the shortest of poems by Italian writer Giuseppe Ungaretti, which is also the title of one of his books on mountain climbing, which I think is quite topical here because getting a cultural experience that is accessible may well be a mountain climbing exercise. His poem is quite simply "M'illumino d'immenso." I illuminate myself with intensity. That's with immensity. That's what culture is about. And it's also to be able to share that sensation, that emotion is something that is far from anything that is dry. So this begs the question, how accessible is culture today? And I make a first inquiry with you about the word accessible city or accessible heritage. And I quote a document of 2007 written by the UK government, Visit Britain, Visit London, in preparation of the 2012 Great Olympic and Paralympic Games. 4,500 athletes and a large number of disabled visitors will descend up in London during that period. Many will want to attend events and attractions. It is important they find that they are accessible. It begs the question, what do we mean by access to culture? Another quote from the city of Mulhouse in France, which, by the way, does some really quite interesting and impressive accessibility stuff. And here, the local authority writes in a document, a committee has been chosen to create a 3-kilometer specific city tour along which every institution, museum, store, and restaurant will become totally accessible for everyone. This begs the question again, what does accessible mean in the context of heritage? And unfortunately, it most of the time means nothing more than accessible pathways. Accessible pathways are not the experience in itself, they are the gateway to it. Cultural accessibility is about sharing cultural experiences and content. It's about more than pathways. It involves, for example, the multisensory experiences I mentioned, accessible information, partaking socially, individually in the wonderful wealth of our cultural heritage, tangible and intangible. So I'd like to say as a proposal that what could cultural accessibility mean? It means, as I think Scott mentioned it, an easy access, easy to use one-stop shop in which a person with any disability can find immediately, instantly the information about travel and culture they need, without the need to make millions of telephone calls. It includes not only reliable information that is concise, we all know that, it also involves sufficiently complete information to enable individual choice-making. And I think we are a little bit far from that so far. It involves a wealth of choice, because the wealth of our culture is endless. How can I enable a touch and a contact and an engagement and a connection with infinite culture through the limited resources I make accessible? And freedom of independent discovery. Measured against these common sense and human rights-based criteria, I would find it very difficult to name a single city in the world that deserves the word accessible city in terms of culture, and that includes destinations for all, and that includes also the big cities of, say, New York, London, Paris, where actually you have some quite amazing, comparatively big accessible cultural offer. I moaned a lot. It's not my nature to be a moaning kind of guy, it's more the nature of experience that gets one to moan. So I want to build a bit of the feel-good factor, show you a really lovely site. It's the official London theatre.co.uk. I looked it up simply by doing searches, and I knew about the site anyway. And I look up signed performances in London, and I find that between the 6th and the 8th of November there are 3 of them. And it's easy to find, it's on a mainstream site. It's only for one branch of cultural life, but it does its job wonderfully well. Now imagine if we connect all this with museums, street festivals, open-air cinema, dance, disability arts, and so on, in a one-stop shop accessing. I could quote or give you examples of about 10 such sites in the world, but one of them being actually Berlin für Blinde in Germany. But they are really very rare, that offer that degree of facility of use. As internet users, we don't want to spend 25 minutes in tricky websites. We want instant access. That's part of the internet culture. Accessible cultural life, just a reminder indeed that we have many barriers still to be overcome. On my picture to the left, Sophie Weaver, access manager then at Colchester Museums, who is a wheelchair user who looks at an exhibition display which is at the height of her rise. This is not a dignified view of the museum experience, nor is it a good one to get to know the objects. On the right-hand side, we find a peculiar French disease, which I call a bizarre designer obsession, where indeed you get blinded by design, not by disability. And that is that obsession in France to have reflective surfaces. They are so nice, and so we are quite a cultured place. Let's make it reflective because it reflects on our own grandeur. And so you get this text on pale grey against slightly less pale grey, and even me with pretty good sight is a bit blinded. And my photo is a little bit manipulated, but it shows you the picture. And there are many of those individual diseases in different countries. If you go to Greece or to any archaeological site, and of course there are many in Greece, it may be the 3 kilometers long of reams of information written by archaeologists for archaeologists in Greek and Latin, which do not resonate with any visitor who wants a much quicker and a less professional access to the experience. Looking at the systemic things on which Scott touched, I want to bring out one issue that is not enough addressed, and I might like to invite my colleagues from the United Nations to see whether they can do something about this. When we look at the number of new museum buildings and extensions that have been built around the world in the past 30 years, that involves probably well over $100 billion or euros or pounds, and that is $100 billion of publicly funded money, of money from private foundations. And when you look at the result of it, be that in Germany, in Greece, in China, in Mexico, wherever you are, very, very little care has been taken to make access to collections and visitor experiences available for people with a sensory impairment or people with a learning disability. The way I would like our civilization to come to think of this in a few years' time is that we are in the presence of a great ethical scandal in the ways cultural funding takes place. We need to raise the stakes, we need to humanize cultural funding criteria. In my view, none of those places deserves any funding just to create a glamorous new museum if they cannot think of their public. So my colleagues at the UN, please see what you can do to help us. Technically, the systemic one is a difficult one because exhibition budgets, learning budgets, and construction budgets are separate, but we need to join the dots here as well. Now, to end on a few good examples where cultural organizations, by engaging with disabled people, create added social cultural capital for themselves and maybe move towards inclusive design. Here at the Tate Modern, we have an exhibition leaflet, information leaflet for information in British Sign Language for deaf visitors. It's so beautifully designed in its colors, bright colors, graphic design, that it is of interest to non-deaf visitors as well. It mediates between two worlds. It's one of the best access leaflets I have seen in my big collection that I travel with in my suitcase. I heard by chance a few years after having spoken a lot about it at conferences that actually it was designed by a deaf designer. Non-deaf people can design great things if they are good designers, but I truly believe that the experience of deafness here was a vocational qualification for this leaflet to have an extra X, a kind of je ne sais quoi, that makes it better. Let's remember that contribution of disabled people. As we are at the Tate, a project I want to very quickly show you that enhances the knowledge of a cultural organization is Tate IMAP. tate.org.uk/IMAC. It's a winner of the Jody Award for Accessible Digital Culture, of which I was director a few years ago, and of which Heather Smith from the National Trust here is currently manager. We also run those awards again, they are international. Have a look at our website. But let's look at what the Tate did. It did a project online for blind and partially sighted pupils many years ago, but it's one of the best I've ever come across, to mediate and communicate one of the key passages in modernity in art, which is a passage of figurative art to abstract art. When you look at this picture on the screen, it is, to me, quite difficult to make out what it means. I always found it difficult to understand. I may see a balcony, I may see a half dome or whatever, but I don't know what to make of it. Here on the website, they showed you that the picture is actually 3 pictures put alongside each other, and they enhance the contrast, and now you see a balcony, and opposite the roadside you see the dome of a mosque, and on the balcony you see a terracotta vase with cacti painted in red and white stripes. And then you reassemble the picture with maximum color contrast, black on white, and so many partially sighted people could actually enjoy that. It turns out that this kind of learning resource, designed for visually impaired people, made me come closer to Matisse than 1 or 2 academic articles I read about it. So indeed, cultural capital and communication of culture can be enhanced by engagement with disabled people. One last example, and it's a very recent one. It's the Musée des Civilisations Européennes et Méditerranéennes, the Museum of Mediterranean and European Civilizations in Marseille, not all too far from where I live, by architect Ricciotti. What you see here on the picture is my nephew Matthias, a bright young man who studies physics, but who only learned to lace his shoes with reasonable degrees of speed at the age of 14 years. But we visited the place together. You see a ramp, maybe 80 meters long in front of you, crossing a street underneath it, getting to the walled ramparts of something called Fort Saint-Jean, which was an island in the Middle Ages on the coast of Marseille. And what you see is also quite a radical intrusion of modern architecture, contemporary architecture, in the holy fabric of heritage. oh, behold, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it would not have been possible. And now architects have found creative ways of picking up the accessibility duty, and they create beautiful stuff that blends contemporary and medieval, in this case. To the right of this walled city is a new museum, which is not shown on the picture. Now, what is interesting here is that this ramp was the product of engagement with how do we make this bloody cityscape with its wide streets and so ever easily accessible to wheelchair users and to people with limited mobility. And it became a place that actually now, in terms of town planning, connects one town quarter called the Panier, which is a very popular, rather poor area of Marseille, with Fort Saint-Jean. And in particular, young people from this area come to Fort Saint-Jean and they chat and they socialize and they appropriate themselves this sacred, hallowed place of European heritage that is usually for the learned middle classes, and it's become their place. So from engagement with accessibility, we ended up here in something that even goes beyond inclusive design as we know the definition of. It goes into inclusive social development and urban development. And I think that is one of the great lessons that we can learn from the engagements we do all in our different places and that we want to take forward. Last slide, recommendations. Well, I think it's for all of us, for you to think of recommendations. And not to make it heavy, I would wish to put one forward that may gel with many of your priorities and preoccupations. It would indeed be a powerful one-stop shop that has not only an accepted standard in terms of information provision, but has the same technology worldwide, that is so well powered by digital technology, that is expensive technology, that is elegant technology, comfortable technology, easy to use technology. These things are possible nowadays, so that at the click of a button, I find everything that is available for me with a specific disability I may have in a particular place. Now, what would that actually mean? It would also mean we want something user-centered. I gave just a couple of examples, and Scott, about the things that are not in place yet. You know many more of those. It also entails that we actually want to turn into a more learning culture as we promote accessibility generally to tourism and to culture, that we want to reflect on our experiences, that we find a more common approach to evaluating what we do. And here again, I'd like to congratulate the organizers who have actually organized an academic strand. The combination disability organizations and academia is by no means an easy one, because sometimes associations feel that academia deprives and actually hijacks their own lives and their own experiences. That kind of gap and tension need not be, and for me, Kirul did absolutely the right choice, and that we also begin to develop together research frameworks by which we can know more about how to design those really good products, and that also means staying in touch with users. And I wish you a wonderful conference.